Welcome back to Sick Development, an Oxfam podcast. I'm your host, Maaza Siyu. Over the last two episodes, we've explored some of the ways that development finance institutions are using taxpayer dollars to fund profiteering, dodgy deals, and exploitation in the global south, all under the guise of providing accessible healthcare. If you have not yet listened to those episodes, I encourage you to go back and to do so now. We are coming back to you today to explore some perspectives of the real-life healthcare and health system impacts of development institutions bankrolling a greater role for companies and investors seeking to make big profits. We will do this with a spotlight on Kenya. Why Kenya? Because alongside India, Oxfam found Kenya to have the highest concentration of private healthcare investments made by development finance institutions, the DFIs. It also has a national health insurance scheme and a government that has embraced and encouraged a greater role for profit seeking healthcare providers. So, in many ways, Kenya has the essential ingredients that DFIs like the World Bank's IFC say are needed to ensure their investments in private healthcare help to expand access for those on low incomes. What could possibly go wrong? In our last episode, we did a deep dive into the schemes of Arif Naqvi, head of one of the largest private equity funds funded by the DFIs to invest in private healthcare in the global south, including in Kenya. We spoke with Simon Clark, co-author of a great book on Naqvi's company, Abraj, to learn how Naqvi spun the capitalist fairy tale via his company that investing in private healthcare was a win-win. It could make investors rich and expand access to people on low incomes. We learned how this fairy tale unraveled with one of the biggest cases of alleged fraud to rock the finance world, and how the real losers in all this were the ordinary people who suffered human rights abuses at the hands of the private hospitals. Today, we will speak with another investigative writer, Morris Kiruga, to learn how he uncovered leaked text messages that gave a rare and powerful insight into how profit motives play out in hospital wards on a daily basis and to the detriment of patients. We will also hear from Dr. Dhavji Atellah, National Secretary General and Chief Executive Officer at the Kenya Medical Practitioners, Pharmacists, and Dentists Union, someone well qualified to share the health worker perspective on the claims made by DFIs that investing in private hospitals in Kenya can advance universal health coverage. And finally, we will chat with an amazing Kenyan feminist and Pan-Africanist, Wangari Kinoti. Wangari explains to me her perspective on the harms caused by DFIs in the health sector in Kenya, particularly for women, and how these trends are part of a broader neo-colonial extractive approach that is shaping African economies in ways that put the interests of corporates and the wealthy elite above the rights of citizens. But first, we are going to start this episode at Nairobi Women's Hospital. This is the hospital funded by the DFIs, by the UK, France, and the World Bank, involved in multiple cases of both alleged and confirmed patient detentions. That means patients and the bodies of deceased patients locked in the hospital sometimes for more than a year when bills could not be paid. This, of course, included the story of Francisca, who we mentioned in episode 1. Her mother's body was retained in the hospital morgue for 2 years. Even the fee to visit her mother's body became too unaffordable for Francisca, who eventually launched a public appeal that the body be released as a Christmas present to her and her siblings so that they could finally bury their mother. Oxfam identified over 30 similarly horrific cases, including 2 that were taken to court, and in which the hospital was found to have acted illegally and in violation of the Kenyan constitution. Perhaps most difficult to understand for those survivors is that the hospital policy of illegally detaining patients was public knowledge before the DFIs invested their taxpayer-backed development funding in the hospital. But there were other scandals too. In January 2020, alleged internal communications were leaked, exposing the daily and hourly pressure purportedly imposed by hospital senior administration on doctors and nurses to increase admissions and delay discharges in order to meet revenue objectives. In one correspondence, the hospital CEO reportedly pushed a staff member to, quote, urgently rectify discharges, which is to say, stop telling patients that they are well enough to leave the hospital. The message read, yesterday you discharged 14, today planned 12. And then the message went on to say that this level of discharge was, quote, not sustainable. In another message, the CEO said, very slow movement. Let us follow the patient on his or her journey. Continue to advocate for higher inpatient numbers. Continue to call for referrals. Maintain occupancy locked. And in yet another message, team, this revenue is too low for the numbers that we have. Are we billing? In response to the leaks, several members of the public reported their own experiences with alleged unethical procedures at Nairobi Women's Hospital and other private hospitals in Kenya. We are now joined by Morris Kiruga, who broke the story of these leaked text messages to get his take on what went down, what role DFIs played, and what we can do from here. Morris, karibu sana, welcome. We're so happy to have you on our Sikh Development podcast. I'll jump right in and ask you to please start for our listeners by explaining a bit more about the content of the leaks and what story they told about what was going on inside Nairobi Women's Hospital.
I think around either late 2018 or early 2019, I received a bunch of screenshots from someone who'd worked at Nairobi Women's and was quite disturbed by what they had seen happening inside there. So the leaks were basically group conversations between top managers of the hospital's branches. And in them, you see the CEO, setting hourly targets for admission. They're following up. They're telling specific hospital managers to cancel discharges because there are too many. They're being given hourly revenue targets, daily revenue targets. This is happening every single hour of the day. And the managers have to send all these reports continuously. So the leaks were very disturbing because if it was any other company, if it was not, if they are talking about something else, some other part of the hospital business, then it would have looked almost innocent. But they were talking about patients. They were talking about people who'd come to them for medical assistance and they'd admitted them. A few of the messages as well implied that they were pushing hospital managers to admit more people, meaning whether you needed to be admitted or not, the first person you met will probably have a target. And although this isn't in the leaks, but it came up in later conversations with sources that there was a financial incentive to each and every clinical officer to admit more people. Yeah, so the very disturbing messages of a corporate culture that was just driven by profit and targets. And while it is a private hospital and needs to be a functional business and all that, it was unethical because first, if you were meant to be discharged and the top managers decided that particular hospital branch had discharged too many people and they kept you for a night longer, that's unethical, not just at a medical level, but it's just unethical because it costs money and healthcare is expensive.
Those messages were just astounding. And, can you tell us a little bit more about the reaction to this leak? I understand that there was an explosion of messages in response from members of the public about their own experiences. What were those real life experiences that you heard about?
So, when I was done investigating the story, I asked myself what the best platform to initially share these leaks was. And I did it first on Twitter, now called X. And then, I shared them with a few people as well, just also for my own safety and to my editors. The reactions were very broad in my Twitter direct messages. It was people sharing stories about, times when they'd been misdiagnosed at a Nairobi Women's Hospital branch, times when their kids especially, and this was quite common. when mothers would say, I went to that hospital and I was told my child has meningitis, for example, and needed surgery or spinal tap procedure done. And then I went to a different hospital and found out it was just an infection that could be treated very cheaply. And then it cascaded from just people reacting to the Nairobi women's story to people sharing broader stories, or other stories from other private hospitals, just about similar experiences, but they weren't quite sure what their recourse was or what was exactly wrong. And sometimes it was a mix of messages, but most of them were about just how, this private healthcare, the experiences were always that these hospitals just want more money from you, whether you're sick or not, whether your child is sick or not, whether your parent is sick or not. There are also stories of patient detentions, which had been coming up for years, and are disturbing in their own way. And yeah, so it was a mix of messages about so many points of possible malpractice, possible unethical behavior, on many levels, not just corporate governance level, but also medical ethics and just pure human decency.
Yeah. And were you surprised, Morris, at the level of the response that you received on WhatsApp and in your DMs, or have these experiences just become part of everyday conversation in Kenya? I mean, do people talk about this on a regular basis, or do you feel that your story opened the door to something that previously had been sort of under the radar?
There was conversation before. I mentioned it in the story where there's these screenshots of a time, I think in 2017 or 2018, when someone shares a screenshots of a post that a mom had made on a Facebook group about Nairobi Women's Hospital branch and her experience there. So these conversations were happening, but they were scattered. People talk to probably to their family, people closest to them. They talk to their communities, whether online or offline. All that my articles and posts did was to bring these things into a singular conversation.
Morris, I'm curious about how the authorities reacted in Kenya. Your story and the explosion of comments from members of the public that we've discussed about their experiences at these private hospitals did prompt a significant response from the authorities, I think. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So among the first things that happened is that as an insurance executive who we've had discussions in the course of my work before, got in touch with me and told me we've always been suspecting Nairobi Women's was bilking us of money. That when people show up with an insurance card, then it is considered sort of a common behavior among private hospitals that when you show up with private insurance, especially, they will give you unnecessary tests. They might admit you when you don't want to be, just the point being to make as much money from the insurer as possible. And yet, even in that kind of an environment, for this insurer and then for the whole association of Kenya insurers, because he was just a window into the kind of conversations they were having at the time, was that it was a major, major issue. Like this hospital had gone far beyond what even others were doing. It was just bilking them of money, filing unnecessary claims, and all that. And this, I feel like the biggest bit for this is that it included the National Hospital Insurance Fund, which is a government-owned, taxpayer-funded insurance fund. So for all these insurers, it was the same feeling, and they told me that my story triggered them to just actually face the problem, which was you can't keep filing claims that we can tell are not either legitimate or are overblown. It also triggered a formal inquiry by the regulator in charge of doctors and pharmacists.
So, in some of your commentary, Morris, you have pointed to the rapid and large scale injection of global finance via private equity firms into Kenya's private healthcare market, claiming that this has increased pressure on hospitals and managers to make money from patients by any means necessary. So, can you share for our listeners more of your thinking on this and how it has impacted Kenyan private hospitals?
I tried to map out the history of private equity funding and the Africa Rising narrative, because I wanted my audience to understand that this was a systemic issue and a global one. Most of this money, and it is a lot of money, once it started flowing into Kenya, it's barely stopped. They were everywhere. And on the one hand, it is a good thing, and we can see why governments also just track foreign direct investment, because capital injection into an economy means that companies can grow a lot faster, they can employ more people, they can, and then people have money to take care of their families, they have money to pay taxes. So that is the advantage, and why governments allowed a lot of and encouraged a lot of private equity funds. On the healthcare side itself is where I feel like the many systemic issues of the private equity model are visible, because unlike, say malls or whatever, hospitals play a really, really fundamental role in just life, in just our everyday life. They're not just simply hospitals. They are the places we go when we are really not okay. They're not places we go by choice or whatever. There is probably a class element to it, but the primary goal is to provide universal healthcare, which is a UN Sustainable Development Goal.
You are hitting the nail on the head, and you're leading us into the next point that I was hoping that we could address, because this is not just about the private equity funding. It's about the fact that in theory we're supposed to be moving closer to reaching those sustainable development goals. And as a journalist, Morris, but also as a Kenyan citizen, what are your views on the fact that development funds from the UK and the French government and from the World Bank are being invested in this way in Kenya?
This is practically neocolonialism in some way, or rather, that's how it feels. It feels like you just like this governments and this Bretton Woods institutions see as plantation. They just the point being that you put in money here as an investment, similar to how the original the original colonial era was done, where a company was sent into Kenya to start a colony, and then the government came in and all that. But then all the value was sent back to the UK and the other colonial powers. At least that bit of it feels to me, as a journalist and a historian, a bit similar. But these are the governments and the bureaucracies that make sure that this kind of behavior is not possible at home. But to see them allow their money to do this here was, one of those things that make me both sad and quite afraid that, this 6 decades after colonialism, bureaucratic perspective might not have changed about the role of, Africa to the world.
It also enrages me that we're still at this point in the 21st century. So, Morris, just now shifting to the accountability of the development finance institutions. We've seen the news, 6 months after Oxfam first gave evidence about the patient detention cases at Nairobi Women's Hospital to the British Parliament. We saw that their shares and the shares of other DFIs via the private equity fund Evercare were just simply sold back to the founder of Nairobi Women's Hospital. This is the same man who is on record explaining his policy of detaining patients. So it feels a little bit like the DFIs have washed their hands of this case.
Definitely, because they're still invested in other hospitals that are less in the news. So, yeah, it's a literal washing of the hands of this particular problem, and selling it to the man that bought it from all those years ago. And it is quite sad and disappointing, because this means that whatever problems might have existed when he saw them and then been worsened while the DFI controlled the hospital might just, now fester because it's back in the hands of the man who founded it. So my hope will probably be that he will try and do a better job this time, but I'm not holding out hope for it. But because of the kind of conversations we've been having for the last few years, a kind of push here for just better healthcare, I'm hoping that some of the system and policy changes might help, hold back some of those bad behaviors. But it is also quite sad that, the DFIs and the PE funds got what they wanted, which was a pump and dump. They literally followed the model to the go, and especially in this case, They let go of a brand that was spoiling their own brand.
And it's easy to pretend that it's the case of just one bad apple when you know and we know that it's the system that is flawed. Um, Morris, I want to talk about the role of writers and journalists. You know, your story prompted a huge response, and as you said, some action on the parts of authorities. But we know that these stories are very difficult to investigate, and the links to the investors are also sometimes almost impossible to trace. We heard this in our first two episodes from the writer of the Sick Development Report, Anna Marriott, and also from Simon Clark, who wrote the book about the Abraj case, that it is very difficult to trace some of those details. So, as a writer and as a journalist, what do you see as the role of journalists in helping to uncover these stories and make change really happen?
We have to keep trying. I feel like a big part of, especially choosing to be an investigative journalist, is that we don't stop because it's hard. We actually, most of the time, are inspired to go on because it is hard. And it is hard and important, actually. It is, I think, our role to keep telling these stories in the way we see them. It is our role to keep trying to make these links. Who's doing what? Because that's practically the work of a journalist. Journalism should hold those in power in whatever way, whether it is structural power because of their in governance, or structural power because they're wealthy, or for whatever reason, to accountable. It is also our work to just keep talking to people. And some of these stories can be very heartbreaking, but we keep talking to people because that's also how we make links between this is actually not just one person's problem. It is a systemic issue that can be addressed. And this is the person who holds power over this. And that's the person we need to hold account on behalf of the people. Because journalism is and must always be a public service, not just for the societies and communities we inhabit physically, but now, for the digital communities, or rather the communities across the globe, for people wherever they may be. It is imperative that we keep telling these stories because most of the time, for example, in the global south, we are experiencing the same things. Just the characters change. Most of the time, it is unclear what the links are to people when one thing happens. And it's our work to bring this into narratives and investigate them and talk about them and write about them and push for change where we can.
Morris, thank you so much for joining us. Morris Kiruga is an investigative reporter from Kenya. It was such a joy to have you on our SIG Development podcast. I am now joined by Dr. Dhavji Atellah, National Secretary General and Chief Executive Officer at the Kenya Medical Practitioners, Pharmacists, and Dentist Union. Welcome to our podcast, Dr. Dhavji.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. So, Dr. Dhavji, I understand that your union acts to both advance collective bargaining power of doctors in Kenya to improve working conditions, but that it also has become an important voice in calling for policy improvements to deliver on government commitments of healthcare for all.
Yes, we champions for the rights of doctors to be supported and to be able to offer services as expected. But we know that there cannot be healthcare providers without the patients being taken care of, without a functional public healthcare. So that's why we actually champion for the right of access to quality healthcare for all the Kenyans.
So, given that, can I ask you what you think about these investments by high income country development institutions and the World Bank in private hospitals in Kenya? And particularly given the type of hospitals that are receiving funds, mostly, from what I understand, very expensive, some might even say elitist hospitals. Do you see a role for these hospitals in delivering universal healthcare in Kenya? Are they responding to the real health needs of the country, or are they creating more challenges as you see it?
The government at a lot of times have given into consideration that for there be access to care, there should be no focus only on the public care. They are seeing that there's also need to have functional private hospitals in the country. And that makes the service provision by private facility very, very important and must be looked into. That do they provide the care that Kenyans actually would expect? Or are they just there in existing to provide profit for the investors in those particular hospitals? When you look at these particular hospitals in the country that are also getting development finance, like Nairobi Women's, on the prospect that they are not driven with the profits. But that does not really resonate with actual service provision that they offer. Because number one, in all these hospitals, for somebody to get admissions, you must prove the ability to pay. That means you must have existing FT insurances. And in many instances, if you do not have insurance, then you must deposit funds to the tunes of 100,000 for you to get care. So it then means that if you are going to access care in these hospitals and you don't have insurance or you do not have that money, then you will be denied that care. And there are many incidences that have been reported that people who run to this hospital to seek this care are denied on the promise of inability to pay. So those are the highlights that indicates that therefore the profit for these investors are much more important than actually service provision.
There seems to be an inherent tension here between the profit making and the delivering quality, equitable healthcare. And these human rights violations were reported by Oxfam. So, my next question for you then would be to ask about the state regulators. Our sense is that the role of the state is to regulate these actors. Yeah. How would you say the government in Kenya is intervening in cases such as the patient detentions that you've mentioned, or in cases of overcharging or poor quality? What are the barriers to effective regulation currently as you see them?
For a long time, the government has been acting as if these investors have a right to actually collect the money for the services that are being offered without really giving regards to the violations of the human rights. As much as it's very clear in the constitution that there is a right for all the Kenyans to access care, the majority of these hospitals will not admit you if you don't have an evidence that you have the ability to pay. And if they admit you the time you show the ability to pay, and once the funds that you deposited is exhausted while you are in this hospital, if whether you get well and if you die, your body will be detained without being released. There's no clear regulations that the state will use to enforce them to release you.
One other question, Dr. Davji, about what the DFIs, the development institutions, are saying about their investment. They have consistently said that their investments in private healthcare will help create jobs. So, as you may know, at Oxfam, we care not just about jobs, but the quality of jobs. And I understand that would be the same for you as the head of the Medical Practitioners Union. So, what, if any, concerns do you have about the working conditions and the welfare of your members working in these hospitals?
These hospitals have developed an approach of exploitation and underemployment of health workers in general. But Nairobi Women's Hospitals, all these hospitals, one thing that they do very strongly is that about 5 to 10% of the doctors are working for them are employed at the right terms. Once they have those minimal numbers, they then engage the rest of the doctors on local basis. And on this local basis, they do not pay them the wages that are prescribed by the professional body. So in the end, they will pay them a quarter or a third of those particular rates. And at one point, I was talking with some of the investors, some of those who own these hospitals, and they say that it's much cheaper to engage these doctors on locum or on casualization terms, because then there's no commitment on their medical insurance, there's no commitment on their pensions. They don't need to consider any other social issues with these particular persons. The scenario now in the country is that any person who is working in a private or facility, they do not consider themselves employed because, as I said earlier, there are no contracts, there are no clear engagements. So everybody yearns to employment in government because we try to push the government hard to actually ensure that the right terms are engaged.
Thank you so much, Dr. Devji.
Thank you.
Oxfam reached out to both Nairobi Women's Hospital and TPG, the private equity fund that owned Nairobi Women's Hospital, via its Evercare fund until just after Oxfam published its reports in 2023. TPG said, quote, "The vast majority of issues raised by Oxfam relate to a significant period in which Evercare was not invested in Nairobi Women's Hospital, and thus we cannot comment in detail." I am now joined by Wangari Kinoti, a feminist and Pan-Africanist who is based in Nairobi and has worked in various roles in the national, regional, and international women's rights and social justice arenas. Wangari is now global lead for women's rights and feminist alternatives at ActionAid International. Thank you so much for joining us, Wangari, and welcome to the Sikh Development Podcast. So I'm going to, Wangari, take you back to Francisca's story in Oxfam's report. Her life was devastated by a private hospital funded by European development finance institutions and the World Bank's IFC. The hospital refused to release her mother's body for 2 years. As a woman, a daughter, a Kenyan, and an advocate for health, what is your reaction, Wangari, to this story? And what do you think it tells us about the way women and girls in particular have been affected by the growing role of the private sector in Kenyan healthcare?
Francisca's experience is, of course, very heartbreaking. It's an experience that's very difficult to hear. And I can't imagine how it has been for Francisca, and my heart really goes out to her. And this, very sadly, is not an isolated incident. It doesn't happen only at one private hospital in one city, in one country. It's really a widespread problem created by the privatization of what should be a public service. So when states fail to provide these, the burden falls heaviest on women as they pick up where the state fails. And the burden here comes in form of increased labor for them. So, in this case also in terms of the lengths that women have to go to as caregivers for people needing health assistance or health attention, but also in costs of money, right? So women have to find the money to pay for privatized services when public services collapse. So privatization means that women who are already the majority of the poorest across the globe are forced to borrow or to stretch whatever meager resources they already have to pay user fees, hospital bills, out-of-pocket payments in order to access health services and other basic services. And in many cases, this leads to unsustainable individual and household debt. And this is kind of the situation that then Francisca finds herself in, where she's then unable to access her mother even after death.
As you know, Oxfam's report focused on the investments made in private hospitals by government-owned development banks from high-income countries. I know that you've undertaken your own research on similar finance models. I believe, that seek to blend development finance with private finance, such as for a medical equipment scheme in Kenya. Can you explain why you think these models are inappropriate for Kenya?
Yeah, and it's not only that they are inappropriate, they are actually harmful. But to draw from the case study you're referring to, where my co-author Crystal Simeone and I looked at these financing models in the context of a medical equipment leasing program through a public-private partnership, a PPP. Just as background, in 2015, the government of Kenya launched this program that provided for the outsourcing of specialized medical equipment for public hospitals across the country. I think it was 98 public hospitals across the country to private sector firms. So we had contracts worth over $430 million signed between the Ministry of Health, central government, the county governments, and private sector, mainly from China, India, Italy, the Netherlands, and the US. But why did we want to look at this? Yes, it was about the actual outcomes, positive or negative, of this particular medical equipment leasing scheme, but we wanted to look at it against the backdrop of the current global financial architecture. And that's why we, sort of opted to name our chapter Medical Equipment Leasing in Kenya, Neocolonial Global Finance and Misplaced Health Priorities. And this is a chapter in a book published earlier this year on corporate capture of development, basically providing a feminist analysis of PPPs. So we looked at the range of right to health related commitments made by the government against the history of its health financing policy, beginning with its earliest colonial iterations, going into the post-colonial era, and the attempts at reform of the same in the early 2000s. But with this particular PPP, one of the things we found, which is common across many PPPs, is the overall lack of transparency and accountability surrounding the contracts in the first place. So, we're talking about the costs and the allocations, and that many of the safeguards against these kinds of challenges around transparency and accountability were being blatantly ignored by multiple private actors. And indeed, in writing our chapter, we found it quite difficult to obtain official information on the program as a whole. And yet this was a really big program with the third biggest allocation in terms of health allocation for just the 2016-2017 fiscal year. On the question also on accountability and transparency, the Kenyan Auditor General at some point had raised several red flags on the whole process. And indeed, one of the private sector suppliers in the deal admitted during a probe on the scheme at the National Senate that the government and therefore the taxpayer was spending 3 times the market price for theatre equipment. And in fact, the Auditor General has called the project a betrayal of trust of the Kenyan taxpayers, saying that the funds would have been better spent on expanding basic healthcare, hiring and training more midwives, and putting in place more clinics and other sort of measures that would have saved more lives. So I'm saying this because it brings us to the central question regarding priority setting, which I think is a central question when it comes to private financing. What informs the decision to spend budgets on one healthcare need versus another? Who are involved? Indeed, who are consulted? And for the information we had available, for example, equipment had remained unused because there was no staff to operate the equipment. There was no water. There was no electricity supply. Many of these counties are in remote, marginalized areas. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that there would be constraints when it comes to supplies of this nature. And actually, a year after the scheme was launched, Kenyan doctors went on the longest nationwide strike in the country's history. It lasted 100 days. What the unions were demanding was better pay and better working conditions, saying that they were overworked, they were underpaid. And these are doctors in public sector, the same sector that is continuously being stripped away from because of these private financing models. So for me, perhaps what is most concerning is how this model is portrayed not only as sort of beneficial, but also as inevitable. A friend of ours, Professor Daniela Gabor, has written about this, calling it a Wall Street consensus, which is an elaborate effort to reorganize development interventions around partnerships with global finance. So global finance becomes the one actor that's most critical to achieving development. So we're talking about the financialization of development and making development investable. And that comes at quite an expense for states and for citizens who are taxpayers, because states have to de-risk to ensure that there's steady cash flow for global investors, and also to engineer local financial systems to allow investors easy entry and easy exit.
Wangari, so in all that enthusiasm and cheerleading about this model, we hear development actors funding all of this, saying that lower income populations and women, especially in your country, Kenya, and mine, Ethiopia, and other countries, that women and low income people will benefit with greater access to better quality healthcare. It's obvious from speaking with you that you would disagree with them. So who are the real winners of these types of investments? We want our listeners to really understand who the winners are. So who would you say the winners are of these types of investments?
Yeah, no, there isn't greater access to quality healthcare. Where is it? We haven't seen it. In privatized healthcare, hospitals are corporations. They become corporations. So the main beneficiaries are the executives and shareholders of those corporations. Of course, if there are patients getting treatment at these hospitals, then they benefit. But the problem is that you can then create the issue of commodification of rights, plus segregations of users actually affecting quality. So the line pushed by powerful private players, by international financing, and increasingly by national governments is that it is easier and more efficient to privatize. The truth is that private delivery of public services, whichever form it takes, means that only those who can afford to pay for a service have access to it. And poor people are hit the hardest. They are not the beneficiary. The women and lower income populations who are supposed to benefit have the risks from the de-risking state to think about. So the risks are transferred to the state and to the taxpayer through the state. So profits are privatized, risks are socialized.
And I've heard you describe the governance of development institutions like the World Bank as neo-colonial. Would you describe these investments by DFIs in private hospitals in Kenya as part of the neo-colonial project and a threat to Kenya's development and sovereignty? And if yes, can you explain in simple terms to our listeners what you mean by this?
So when we talk about neo-colonial nature of global architectures, we are referring to a number of factors. But for this particular podcast, if we're looking at the issue of financialization, so financialization, or what I would describe as the increasing importance of financial markets to the operations of an economy and its governing institutions, both at national and international level. And by financial markets, I'm including financial motives, financial institutions, whichever they may be, and of course, financial elites. Okay, so sort of the billionaire class. A major driver of financialization is the G20, with the G7 controlling the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and many multilateral development banks. Something that Jason Hickel, who is an economic anthropologist, describes as a global apartheid in the global governance system. And an example here is that for every vote that the global north has at the World Bank, Africa south of the Sahara has 0.17 of that vote, which is, what we're talking about here, measurement in income per capita. So I don't know. I mean, Jason Hickel gave us those figures. Maybe the figures have since changed, but they would still reflect a really obscene imbalance of decision-making power in favor of the rich global north country. So indeed, it is imperative to look at the global governance rules and institutions. I mean, this 1944 conference in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire created the IMF and what eventually became the World Bank. And this is happening in 1944 at a time when many, many parts of the world were under imperial rule. So nobody from the colonized world was at the table. So regardless of the sort of iterations we have seen since that time, it is no surprise that the interests of the majority world are not protected in these institutions. Today, the IMF has something like 190 member states. The membership depends on each country fulfilling its monetary quota, and the amount is decided by the size of each country's role in the international economic system. So basically, the richer you are, the more decision-making power you have. So the majority of the world's population, which is poor, and in the majority world, is grossly underrepresented in these institutions. And it is these institutions that determine what our lives and livelihoods look like. So in asking whether there's a role for private finance in healthcare, the question is not about the corporations themselves, although there is the critical element of corporate accountability, but rather the real motive of private finance as a whole. Maza, some refer to this as, a 19th century financial imperialism repackaged in a more sanitized form. This is colonization of the state by financial capital, and it is directly connected to the feminist and Pan-Africanist and other majority world struggles. They're all connected to the realities of sovereignty in making decisions. It's connected to the dismantling of those visible and invisible power structures that sustain colonial relations. So this is going beyond flag independence, which is what people tend to think about when we talk about colonization. It's about disrupting and delinking from those legacies. The colonial machinery is always reinventing itself. We have to remain alive to that.
The colonial machinery is always reinventing itself. We are so happy that we were able to include your voice in this podcast. Wangari is a feminist, Pan-Africanist, the global lead for women's rights and feminist alternatives at ActionAid International. Thank you so much for joining us for our podcast.
Thank you very much, Baz. I enjoyed the conversation.
I hope you all enjoyed those super interesting conversations as much as I did. Listeners who want to learn more, please look for the recently published collection on corporate capture of development, where you'll find a chapter co-authored by Wangari Kinoti titled Medical Equipment Leasing in Kenya, Neo-Colonial Global Finance and Misplaced Health Priorities. To find Morris Kiruga's amazing investigative work, please check his feeds. He's on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Owaahh, Owaahh, and his blog is under the same handle, owaahh.com. Thank you for listening to Sikh Development. Stay tuned for our next episode as we cross to the other side of the world to look specifically at the harm done by development finance institutions on the healthcare system in India. Once again, if you missed our first 2 episodes, please go back and listen. As ever, we would love it if you took a moment to leave a review and subscribe to the Equals podcast so you won't miss the next episode of our mini series. I hope you'll join us.